So for the longest time, mathematicians had a hard time dealing with trying to find the square root of negative values. We can find the square root of 9 because that's equal to 3. But if you make this a negative 9, then it becomes not quite so easy, because 3 times 3 does not give you negative 9, but neither does negative 3. So we're just to the point where we would just say there is no solution to this. So mathematicians decided to, several hundred years ago, come up with a way of dealing with these types of problems. And so what they decided is, we're going to split this up and say negative 9 is equal to the square root of negative 1 multiplied by the square root of 9. Because those two multiplied together do give you the square root of negative 9. Now, the square root of 9 is a real number. That has a value of 3. And this square root of negative 1 is so prominent and comes into play so often that they decided to just assign this value a letter, and we're going to call it I. And so the solution to this particular simplifying is 3i. And so what we have then is that I is equal to square root of negative 1, which means if you square both sides, you're going to get I squared on the left, and when you square a square root, all you're left with is what's inside, which is negative 1. So I squared equals negative 1. What this means is that a simplified answer will never have square root of negative something in it. And a simplified answer will never have I squared either, because I squared will be converted to negative 1. All right, so let's look at some simplifying of some problems here. So the square root of negative 25 can break apart into square root of negative 1 times square root of 25. Square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So that's what it simplifies down to. Square root of negative 16 breaks apart like this. Square root of 16 is 4, and square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 49 breaks apart, or negative 49 breaks apart like this, and the square root of 49 is 7, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So essentially all you're doing is just taking the square root of whatever this number is and then attaching I to it, because the square root of the negative comes out as a I every single time. Okay. All right, so all of those square roots came out evenly. The next one, we can say this breaks up into square root of negative 1 times square root of 20. Now, square root of 20 does not come out evenly, so that's 4 times 5, which is 2 times 2 times 5. You have a pair of 2's. So the 2's will come outside of the radical, and this converts to I. So on the outside, you're going to have 2i. On the inside, you're left with a 5. The next one, similar. Square root of negative 1 times square root of 48. 48 is 4 times 12. 4 times 12. 4 is 2 times 2. 12 is 4 times 3, which is 2 times 2 times 3. So we have 2 pair of 2's. That will come out as a 4. You have the square root of negative 1, which is I. Inside the radical, you're left with 3. So now for solving equations, what we need to do is isolate the quadratic term. So you are going to subtract 16. 8 minus 16 will give you a negative 8. Then you divide by 2, which gives us negative 4. And then you take the square root. Now, whenever you are solving an equation and you take a square root, you must always put a plus or minus in front of this. Because, for example, if you had x squared equals 9, there are two solutions to that. X equals 3 is a solution because 3 squared equals 9. Negative 3 is also a solution because negative 3 squared will give you positive 9 as well. So you will always have two possible answers, a positive and a negative value here. So now this one simplifies down. The negative comes out as I. The square root of 4 is 2. So you are left with plus or minus 2i. All right, so the next one, you're going to add 2 over to the left side. Negative 4 plus 2 is negative 2. We'll then multiply by 3, which means x squared equals negative 6. And so x is equal to plus or minus square root of negative 6. The negative comes out, which makes it plus or minus I root 6. And when you have a binomial multiplied by a binomial and we have i's in here, we treat it basically the same way. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times negative I is negative 3i. I times 2, positive 2i. And then I times negative I is negative I squared. Now remember that I squared is negative 1. So minus a negative 1 makes this a positive 1. These two simplify together to give us minus I. And then we have this 6 in the front. So now this combines to give you 7 minus I. And one more of these. 4 times 5 is 20. 4 times negative 3 is minus 12i. 6i times 5 plus 30i. And then 6i times negative 3i is negative 18i squared. So once again, this is I squared, which is negative 1, times negative 18, which is positive 18. These combine together to give us 18i, and then we have our 20. So this simplifies down to 38 plus 18i. All right, and the next one, distributing each parenthesis, this will give you 12i. This will give you plus 2i squared. Negative 3i times 1 is negative 3i. And then negative 3i times 4i is minus 12i squared. So now 2i squared, this has a value of negative 2. Negative 12i squared has a value of positive 12. We can combine negative 2 and positive 12. That will give us 10. Then we have 12i and minus 3i, which is plus 9i. Now, if you have three things multiplied together, what we will do is multiply the first two together, get an answer, and then multiply it by the last one. All right, so 3 times 3, that's 9. outside is negative 3i, inside is positive 3i. Those two things will cancel each other out. Then you have minus I squared. Now, this turns into 9 plus 1, which is 10. We now take this 10 and multiply it by this other parenthesis here. So that will give us 40 plus 20i. And we're done.